All right, welcome back. And today we are going to start our discussion of metabolism. This is going to span chapters 8, 9, and 10. This will include photosynthesis. So let's go ahead and get started. So concept 8.1, an organism's metabolism transforms matter and energy, subject to the laws of thermodynamics. So, metabolism is simply the totality of all of the chemical reactions within a cell, including us breaking down food into smaller and smaller pieces, gaining energy, us making ATP, making proteins. All of those chemical reactions are involved here. And when this metabolism breaks down is when we cease to have life, right? So when we lose all of these chemical reactions, an organism dies. So you can kind of reverse engineer that to say, well, we are alive because we have these ongoing chemical reactions. So various chemical reactions are broken down into various metabolic pathways. So if we need a particular product, such as here product D, whatever this molecule is, and we need to build it or break it down or whatever it is that we're doing, we do it in a multi-step process. And each small chemical reaction is facilitated by its own enzyme. So here we have a starting molecule A, we want to turn it into D, but it takes several steps. So we're going to take A, we're going to turn it into B. Enzyme 1 catalyzes this reaction and only this reaction. It only interacts with A and produces B. It doesn't interact with C or D at all. B is then converted into C through enzyme 2. C is converted into D through enzyme 3. Each one of these enzymes are specific for the reaction that they're catalyzing and only interact with their molecules. We can take all these various biochemical pathways and build them into a larger map, but we can kind of define that map by two competing processes. So one is catabolic pathways, where we are breaking things down, larger complex molecules, into simpler ones. And oftentimes we are harvesting the energy from these reactions. Conversely, if we are building larger molecules, this is what we call an anabolic pathway. So we take simple starter compounds and we turn them into larger, more complex molecules. So examples of this is when we break down glucose and produce ATP from it, we are taking something, a large complex molecule, and breaking it down ultimately into carbon dioxide. So this is a 6-carbon compound. We're going to end up producing 6 carbon dioxides from this. And in this process, it will release energy, and we can harvest that energy and turn it into ATP. Anabolic pathways, where we are building things, requires us to consume the energy that we made in order to make this happen. An example of this would be synthesis of proteins from amino acids. So we're taking all these individual amino acids, we're linking them together. That process requires energy. That energy ultimately came from this catabolic pathway. So energy is simply the capacity to cause change. And certain forms of energy can perform what we call work, okay? Performing a task that we want to happen. So let's talk about the different forms of energy. We have kinetic energy, which is associated with motion. So anything that is moving is utilizing kinetic energy to do so. A subset of that is something that we call thermal energy, or simply heat. This is the kinetic energy associated with molecules kind of randomly moving around. Could be simple as just vibrating back and forth or bouncing off other molecules. But that amount of energy is what we call thermal energy, and if we raise the temperature of a substance, those molecules move faster. If we cool it down, they move slower. And theoretically, it's possible to cool things down to the point where they stop moving altogether. Not something that we can actually achieve at this point, but theoretically that state exists. Another form of energy is potential energy. This is energy that is stored simply because of how matter is structured or how it is located relative to other matter. So, for example, if you are a diver standing on a diving board with empty space below you to the swimming pool, that is stored energy, right? That energy exists in that state, but you tip over and you fall off the diving board. Now all that potential energy gets converted into kinetic energy. So that kinetic energy of falling doesn't come from anywhere or just doesn't spring into being. It already existed in this thing that we call potential energy. We also have this thing called chemical energy, and this is energy that can be released through a chemical reaction. So in a way, chemical energy is a form of potential energy. Now, energy can be converted from one form into another, but it can't be spontaneously created, and it can't ever go away. So here we have a diver on a diving board. This diver has potential energy because it's being held up away from the surface. Gravity is pulling the diver down, but something is preventing the diver from falling. Once that diver jumps off, we release that potential energy and convert it into kinetic energy. That causes the diver to accelerate towards the earth. Once the diver hits the water, that energy is dissipated into the water around it. Okay? So while that energy is gone from us, it's still out there in the universe. We then swim back over and we climb up the ladder. Now, climbing up the ladder requires kinetic energy. Where does that kinetic energy come from? Well, we utilize food that we've eaten, we break it down through catabolic pathways, we turn it into chemical energy, and then we slowly release that chemical energy to make our muscles work, and that converts that chemical energy into kinetic energy. We then can utilize that kinetic energy to move us up. Once we get up to the top back on the diving board, all of that kinetic energy from all the food that we've been digesting has now been restored in the form of potential energy. All right, so there are laws that govern the transformation of energy from one form to another. This field of science is called thermodynamics. Oftentimes we study thermodynamics in an isolated system, or a closed system, where energy cannot move outside of its surroundings. Okay, an example of this would be a thermos of coffee or a Yeti cup filled with coffee. All that thermal energy in the coffee is stored inside of it and it can't escape. Now, no system is truly closed. Slowly that energy would leak out, but we can study it as an isolated system. Conversely, an open system is a system where energy and matter can be transferred between one system to another system and ultimately all around itself. Now, organisms are open systems. We gain energy from other organisms by eating them and then utilize that energy to do our own work. Now, the laws that govern this energy transformation, the first of which, the first law of thermodynamics, is that energy can be transferred and transformed, but it cannot be created or destroyed. Okay? This is also called the principle of conservation of energy. So energy doesn't just spontaneously come into being and it can't be destroyed. It can only be transferred and transformed. So all the energy that we have came from somewhere. The second law of thermodynamics is that um, every energy transfer or transformation will only occur if it increases the entropy of the universe or the disorder of the universe. This fundamental law here, this idea of entropy, is what drives everything forward. So everything is moving towards maximum disorder. Now, we can kind of harvest some of that energy along the way. So we can take things, we can break it down, store a little bit of that energy, but ultimately all of that energy is going to leave us, right? So even when we are just walking around, we are generating heat. That heat radiates out away from us. So we are constantly losing that energy in some way, shape, or form. We can just borrow it along its path. So, an organism's metabolism transforms matter and energy, subject to the laws of thermodynamics. So we have these biochemical pathways. We take small steps to turn one thing into another. Each one of these steps is catalyzed by an enzyme. We can take these long pathways and break them up into two parts. One, catabolic pathways, which break things down, anabolic pathways, which build things up, right? And we can only build things up because we are gaining or capturing energy from these breakdown processes. And this conversion of energy, um, this transformation and transformation is governed by these laws. So the first law is that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It's either transferred or transformed. Second law of thermodynamics is this transformation and transfer only happens when there is an increase in entropy in the universe or the amount of disorder.